The 1980s were obsessed with looking forward, but some cars crashed headfirst into failure. Bold designs hid weak engines, broken tech, and false promises. How did so many futuristic dreams stall before they even left the driveway? The 1982 Cadillac Samaran was supposed to help Cadillac move into the compact market, but instead it became the gold standard for automotive failure. On the surface, it wore the Cadillac badge proudly, but underneath, it was little more than a Chevrolet Cavalier in a tuxedo. The engine was a basic four-cylinder that whined more than it roared. The interior was cramped, with hard plastics and trim that looked borrowed from a rental car. The performance was underwhelming, especially for a brand that once set the standard for American luxury. And yet, the price tag soared because of the nameplate. Buyers expecting Cadillac smoothness, power, and prestige were handed a dressed-up economy car with barely any of the brand's signature refinement. Enthusiasts were outraged, critics pounced. The press called it lazy, cynical, and embarrassing. Cadillac's reputation took a major hit, and General Motors scrambled to justify the move. Marketing tried to spin it as European-inspired, but no one was buying it, figuratively or literally. The Samaran sold poorly, was quietly dropped, and remains a cautionary tale. You cannot fake luxury, not with stitching, not with chrome, and definitely not with a badge. Sometimes, a legacy is not built, it is dismantled. The 1981 Delorean DMC12 looked like it drove straight out of a science fiction film, and in some ways, it did. Its stainless steel body and gull-wing doors made it instantly iconic, turning heads even while parked. But under the surface, it was a troubled machine, underpowered, overpriced, difficult to manufacture. The Pujo Renault Volvo V6 engine made just over 100 horsepower, laughable for a sports car. Quality control was a nightmare, and early models were plagued with electrical gremlins, loose panels, and poorly fitted parts. Door seals leaked, dashboards warped. Then came the scandal. Company founder John DeLorean was arrested in a cocaine sting operation, and suddenly the car's futuristic gleam turned into tabloid fodder. Production halted, and the dream unraveled. Despite its later fame in pop culture, the DMC-12 was a commercial disaster. It failed to meet its lofty goals and left behind a warehouse of unsold ambition. Today, people remember the car more for its movie legacy than its actual performance on the road. It is a symbol of vision, failure, and what happens when style moves faster than substance. The 1980 Chevrolet Citation was General Motors' first big push into front-wheel drive, an effort to modernize its lineup and fight off foreign competition. But the launch was rushed, and the cracks showed almost immediately. Brake failures, rusted bodies, suspensions that collapsed under pressure, transmission issues dogged the early models, and misaligned steering columns made handling feel like guesswork. The Citation came out strong in sales, but quickly earned a reputation for unreliability. It was boxy, yes, but that was not the problem. The problem was that it felt unfinished. Cheap materials, inconsistent quality, and a driving experience that never inspired confidence. GM had marketed it as innovative, practical, and perfectly American. But buyers soon found themselves stuck with cars that shuddered, squeaked, and stalled. Lawsuits piled up, recalls followed, and the goodwill dried up fast. It even became a punchline in late-night comedy, symbolizing Detroit's worst instincts. What should have been a new chapter for Chevrolet became a footnote of frustration. The Citation did not just fail, it taught an entire generation not to trust promises stamped in chrome. The 1984 Ford EXP was supposed to be a sporty two-seater version of the Ford Escort, a compact car reimagined for young drivers looking for flair. But the EXP ended up with none of the performance and even less personality. The engine was weak, especially compared to the Sportier coupes coming out of Japan at the time. The handling was sluggish, the steering vague, and the road feel uninspired. For a car marketed as bold and different, it looked oddly dull. Ford tried hard to pitch it as a fun commuter car, sleek, affordable, and modern. But in reality, it felt more like a lonely escort missing its back seat. It lacked excitement. It lacked buzz. Even the advertising could not figure out what the EXP was trying to be. Some versions added a turbo, but it was too little, too late. Consumers shrugged, sales tanked, and just a few years later, the model disappeared with barely a whisper. Even among Ford enthusiasts, the EXP has no cult following. The EXP was not a disaster because it did something wrong. It was a disaster because it never did anything right. It promised a thrill and delivered a yawn. The 1982 Renault Fuego had a name that meant fire, but it was remembered more for putting itself out. This French import arrived in the United States with big dreams and bold curves. Its wedge-shaped, wraparound rear glass and digital dashboard made it look like it had come from the future. But when American drivers got behind the wheel, the illusion quickly faded. Reliability was abysmal. Parts were hard to find. Electronics failed constantly. The turbo version offered a flash of excitement, but most models were underpowered and unpredictable. Renault underestimated just how much American buyers cared about service and longevity, and the Fuego flamed out fast. It was expensive, impractical, and confusing to repair. The stylish hatchback that once turned heads became an eyesore parked in repair shop lots. Today, the Renault Fuego is a rare sight, mostly because so few survived. It came in hot and left cold. The 1985 Yugo GF made headlines as the cheapest new car in America. But cheap came with a price, and the Yugo paid dearly. Built in the former Yugoslavia and imported with bold promises, it was meant to give cost-conscious buyers an entry into car ownership. But almost everything about the Yugo felt like a compromise too far. The engine was noisy, the transmission clunky, and interior trim came loose with the slightest touch. Reviewers described it as toy-like, unstable, and barely roadworthy. On the highway, it struggled to keep up. On hills, it begged for mercy. Repairs were frequent and frustrating, and many new owners regretted the purchase before their first oil change. It became a late-night comedy punchline and the butt of every bad car joke for decades. Some cars fade into obscurity. The Yugo earned infamy. It proved that cutting costs without care leads to one destination: failure. The 1981 AMC Eagle SX/4 was one of those rare ideas that arrived before the world was ready. It was a compact two-door with four-wheel drive, blending off-road ruggedness with urban practicality. In theory, it was brilliant. In execution, it was flawed. AMC struggled with quality control, and the Eagle SX/4 suffered from awkward handling, creaky interiors, and a drivetrain that felt more tractor than car. The design was boxy, and the cabin felt cramped. Yet underneath it all, there was real innovation, just buried under years of corporate dysfunction and cost-cutting. AMC was already on its last legs, and the Eagle could not save it. Drivers who owned one often appreciated its grit, but they also endured its breakdowns and quirks. Eventually, Subaru and other brands perfected the all-wheel drive formula. The Eagle was just a prototype for a future it would never see. The 1986 Pontiac 6000 STE AWD was the future according to Pontiac. Digital dash, all-wheel drive, electronic everything. On paper, it was packed with features no other sedan in its class could touch. But in practice, it was a complicated, unreliable mess. The electronics glitched, the AWD system was clunky, and repairs were expensive. Drivers who expected high-tech harmony were met with blinking warnings and mechanical headaches. Pontiac billed the 6000 STE as a European-style performance sedan, but it had none of the refinement. It felt heavy. It felt overworked. It felt like technology running just ahead of its own understanding. While it did offer all-wheel drive in an era that was still new to the idea, it lacked the polish and consistency needed to make that innovation stick. The 6000 STE was not a total failure, but it came too soon and delivered too little. The 1982 Chrysler Imperial wanted to bring old-school luxury into the digital age, but the transition was rocky. On the outside, it wore the sharp lines, boxy silhouette, and gleaming chrome trim that screamed old money prestige. It looked like something a retired executive would drive to a private golf club in Palm Springs. But on the inside, it was trying hard to be the future. Chrysler loaded the Imperial with one of the earliest digital dashboards, voice alerts, and a fuel injection system controlled by a primitive onboard computer. Unfortunately, none of it worked the way it should have. The electronic dash flickered. The fuel injection system was erratic. The engine stumbled and surged, leaving both drivers and mechanics confused and frustrated. At a time when Chrysler desperately needed a win, the Imperial felt like a bloated experiment. Reliability took a hit, gas mileage was poor, and the ride, while soft, felt disconnected from the road, like floating on a sofa bolted to a shopping cart. Chrysler marketed the Imperial as a return to elegance, even offering special Frank Sinatra editions, complete with branded cassettes. But all the names and styling in the world could not hide the clunky mechanics and aging foundation underneath. Sales were slow, and buyers were not impressed. In trying to bridge the past and the future, the Imperial ended up stuck in a limbo of unfulfilled promises. It was a luxury car that no longer understood what luxury meant. The 1980 Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Volare were holdovers from the previous decade, and by the 1980s, they were embarrassments. Built on aging platforms and clinging to outdated design, these cars were already struggling when the new decade rolled in. Known for catastrophic rust problems, failing suspensions, and erratic quality control, the Aspen and Volare had earned a bad reputation even before the first 1980 models rolled off the line. Dodge and Plymouth tried to extend their lifespans with cosmetic tweaks, new grills, paint schemes, maybe an optional trim package, but the core problems never went away. Engines sputtered and stalled. Carburetors needed constant adjustment. The interiors, filled with brittle plastics and peeling vinyl, degraded faster than the warranty expired. Road noise was loud, steering was vague, and every mile felt like a negotiation with fate. Meanwhile, Japanese imports were getting better every year, more reliable, more efficient, and far more modern. Buyers could feel how far behind they were just sitting in the driver's seat. Still, Chrysler seemed unwilling to admit defeat. Advertising promised value and tradition, but the truth was hard to hide. Eventually, they had no choice. The Aspen and Volare were quietly retired, two relics of a time the industry wanted to forget. Today, they rarely show up at car shows, auctions, or nostalgia pages, because unlike some failures that inspire affection, these ones just wore out their welcome. The 1985 Merc XR4T was Ford's bold experiment to bring European performance to American buyers, but it tripped on its own branding before it even left the lot. Sold under the unfamiliar Mercure name, this sporty import came with a turbocharged engine, rear-wheel drive, and edgy styling. On paper, it had the right ingredients, but the name meant nothing to most buyers, and the strange pronunciation confused everyone. Worse, it was sold only through select Lincoln Mercury dealers who often had no idea how to market or service it. Parts were expensive and hard to source, maintenance was tricky, and the turbo lag made city driving a chore. Enthusiasts appreciated the rally-inspired chassis and the hatchback practicality, but the average American car shopper did not know what they were looking at, and quickly stopped caring. Reviews were mixed, support from Ford was lukewarm, and by the time anyone figured out how to spell the name, the car was gone. It lasted just a few short years before being phased out. The Merc XR4T was not a bad car. It was a misplaced one. A European idea dropped into a market that just was not ready. Or maybe, Ford just got tired of trying to explain what it was. The 1987 Cadillac Alente was a high-stakes gamble meant to take on the world's best luxury roadsters. Designed in Italy by Pininfarina and airshipped to the United States for final assembly, the Alente had the pedigree, the style, and the marketing budget of a superstar. But what it did not have was execution. Under the hood, it ran on a front-wheel drive Cadillac platform and was powered by an engine that could not match the car's price tag or visual promise. The ride was stiff, the electronics were unreliable, and the digital dashboard was ahead of its time in all the wrong ways. It was not just overpriced, it was outgunned. For the same money, buyers could get a Mercedes-Benz SL with proven reliability and rear-wheel performance. Cadillac tried to sell the Alente as a fusion of European style and American comfort, but what buyers got was an awkward hybrid that was neither comfortable enough nor sporty enough. Sales were sluggish, repairs were costly, and every attempt to revise or improve the model came too late. In the end, the Alente became a luxury car that chased a dream but never caught it. It was supposed to put Cadillac back on the map. Instead, it became a dot on the side of the road. The 1983 Honda Prelude was supposed to usher in a new chapter of Japanese sportiness, but it stumbled at the starting line. This was the first-generation Prelude to reach American shores, and expectations were high. Honda had already built a reputation for quality, value, and clever engineering. But the Prelude, despite its sporty looks and pop-up headlights, lacked the excitement buyers were promised. The engine was weak, the acceleration was slow, and reliability, usually Honda's strongest suit, suffered from teething problems in the new design. Suspension components wore out quickly, interior trim rattled, and while the car handled decently in corners, it felt gutless in straight-line performance. It looked like a sports car. It acted like an underpowered commuter. Competing against more powerful coupes and hot hatches, the Prelude fell flat. It did have its fans, mostly for its futuristic dash and tidy size, but even loyal Honda buyers expected more. Later generations would fix these flaws and turn the Prelude into a beloved icon. But this first outing left a bland impression. Today, the original Prelude is rarely remembered, not because it was terrible, but because it was underwhelming, a rare stumble from a company that usually got it right. The 1980 Buick Skylark was part of the infamous X-body lineup, and it inherited every one of the platform's notorious issues. Like its sibling, the Chevrolet Citation, the Skylark was meant to modernize General Motors' compact car offerings. Instead, it became a case study in rushed engineering. Steering problems were frequent and dangerous, with some models pulling to one side unpredictably. Rust was another major issue, especially in northern climates. The interior was cramped and filled with hard, brittle plastics that cracked under sunlight. Buick tried to dress the car up with better trim and branding, but the mechanical flaws ran deep. Customers complained about vibrations, loose panels, and cheap-feeling controls. And while the car was supposed to be economical, its real-world fuel economy often disappointed. It also lacked the smooth ride and comfort Buick had once been known for. The brand's older buyers were confused by the compact form. Younger buyers saw better options from Japan. The Skylark of 1980 failed to appeal to either group. It was a car that tried to be everything and ended up as almost nothing. General Motors had hoped it would be a flagship for the future. Instead, it became an embarrassing reminder of what happens when a company cuts corners. The 1984 Dodge Daytona Turbo Z had every intention of being a high-performance star. A turbocharged four-cylinder, a dramatic wedge shape, sport seats, and bold graphics. It looked fast, even when parked. But behind the wheel, the reality was less exciting. Turbo lag made acceleration unpredictable. The steering lacked precision, and build quality was wildly inconsistent. Dodge had marketed the car as a domestic rival to European coupes, but the Daytona never reached that level of sophistication. The interior was filled with plasticky switches and stiff controls. Rattles appeared early, trim came loose, and reliability issues began stacking up. Many owners loved the idea of the car more than the experience of driving it. The Turbo Z trim especially promised excitement, but often delivered more frustration than fun. Maintenance was a chore, with turbo components prone to failure and parts not always easy to find. Over time, the Daytona's image faded. It was not a total failure, it had its fans, but it never lived up to its own hype. In a decade that celebrated performance, the Daytona Turbo Z was all sizzle and not enough steak. The The 1985 Peugeot 505 arrived in the United States with high hopes and French flair, but quickly found itself out of step with the American market. It was a comfortable car with a soft ride, rear-wheel drive, and even an available diesel engine. It had luxury appointments, stylish lines, and a quiet sophistication that appealed to a niche audience. But the moment things went wrong, and they often did, ownership became a nightmare. Parts were hard to find, dealerships were few and far between, and mechanics unfamiliar with the car often made matters worse. The diesel variant was especially slow and noisy. Electrical gremlins haunted the dashboard, and reliability just never measured up to the competition. In Europe, the 505 had a decent following. But in America, it was too fragile for long road trips and too obscure for easy maintenance. Peugeot tried to market it as a sophisticated alternative to BMW and Mercedes, but it lacked their polish and brand power. In the end, the 505 faded away, along with the entire Peugeot brand in the United States. It was not the worst car of the decade, but it was one of the most misplaced. A European suit in an American garage with a broken zipper. The 1988 Sterling 825 was a British-American hybrid that should have worked, but instead it failed in slow motion. Built by Rover in the United Kingdom using Honda Legend mechanicals, the Sterling was supposed to bring together Japanese reliability with British luxury and charm. What it brought instead was frustration. The styling was clean, the leather seats were plush, and it looked like a respectable luxury car. But the build quality was poor. Panels did not align, electronics failed early. The interior trim, wood and all, started falling apart after just a few months. And while the Honda V6 engine was solid, the rest of the car around it felt like it was assembled with blindfolds. American buyers were hopeful when the Sterling debuted. It looked fresh, it had the right components. But ownership turned into a guessing game of what would break next. Dealerships struggled to keep up with repairs, and Rover's already shaky reputation sank lower. Sales never reached expectations, and by the early 1990s, the brand was gone from the American market entirely. The Sterling 825 was a car that came close, but its flaws dragged it down, proof that good bones are not enough when the body is crumbling. The 1983 Lincoln Continental Mark VI diesel was an answer to a question nobody asked. During the early 1980s oil crunch, Lincoln decided to offer a diesel version of its full-size luxury coupe. The result was predictably bizarre. Under the hood was a 5.7-liter V8 diesel borrowed from General Motors, and it sounded like a farm truck. Loud, slow, and unrefined. The acceleration was glacial. The engine shook the whole chassis, and the typical Lincoln smoothness was replaced with diesel rattle and hesitation. Worse, the engine itself was unreliable. Head gasket failures, cold start issues, poor longevity. Buyers expecting serene luxury were handed a car that felt like it belonged in a tractor pull. Inside, the plush velour seats and wood grain trim clashed with the constant growl of the diesel clatter. Fuel economy was only marginally better than a gas V8, and the performance sacrifice made it hard to justify. The diesel Mark VI was a novelty, and not a good one. It was dropped quietly, almost as if Lincoln hoped everyone would forget it ever existed. And for the most part, they did. It was not just a bad car, it was a bad idea. The 1981 Chevrolet El Camino was already nearing the end of its long and unusual life. A car-truck hybrid that once found favor with ranchers, handymen, and muscle car fans, the early 1980s versions had lost most of their edge. The styling felt dated, the powertrains were underwhelming, and the novelty had worn off. By 1981, it was clear the El Camino no longer fit in a changing market. Trucks were getting more refined, sedans were becoming more efficient, and the El Camino, once a clever compromise, just felt like a relic. Chevrolet did little to modernize it, instead coasting on nostalgia. The V8 engines had been detuned, the interiors were uninspired, and younger buyers were not interested in a car that looked like a mullet on wheels. Sales declined, dealerships gave up, and the El Camino quietly rolled into history just a few years later. Today, the earlier models still have a cult following, but the final years? They are mostly forgotten. Because by the 1980s, the El Camino was not bold, it was just tired. The 1982 Oldsmobile Omega tried to bring premium appeal to General Motors' compact X-body lineup, but ended up dragging Oldsmobile's reputation down with it. Sharing its platform with the notoriously flawed Chevrolet Citation, the Omega had front-end alignment issues, rust problems, and cheap-feeling materials. The ride was choppy, the steering wandered, and the overall build quality was inconsistent at best. Oldsmobile added some faux wood and nicer trim, but it was not enough. Buyers quickly saw through the dressing. The Omega lacked identity. It was too expensive for budget shoppers and too basic for anyone seeking true luxury. Reliability was spotty, repairs were common, and resale value sank like a stone. Worse, it shared too much DNA with its struggling siblings, the Buick Skylark and Pontiac Phoenix, so it could not stand out even within General Motors' own family. By the mid-1980s, the Omega name quietly disappeared. It was a car that never earned loyalty, never built momentum, and left barely a ripple in automotive history. A forgettable badge on a forgettable platform. The 1984 Maserati Burbo was supposed to bring Italian performance to the American middle class, but it brought headaches instead. Priced as an affordable luxury sports car, the Burbo had twin turbochargers, sleek lines, and the prestige of a legendary Italian badge. It looked exotic, it sounded fast, and it promised to deliver that Maserati magic at a fraction of the cost. But under the hood and inside the cabin, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The twin-turbo V6 was temperamental and over-engineered. The carburetors were finicky. The electronics were a mess. Bits and pieces fell apart almost as fast as the value. Owners complained of failing fuel systems, overheating, weak electrical components, and interiors that seemed allergic to sunlight. The dashboard warped, switches broke, relays failed, and mechanics often refused to touch them. It was not uncommon to see Burbos in pristine condition sitting dead in driveways. Maserati's dealer network was small, parts were expensive, and most owners quickly realized they had bought more trouble than thrill. Despite the name and the styling, it had none of the reliability needed to survive the real world. The Burbo might be one of the most ambitious failures of the decade, a car that wanted to democratize Italian performance, but ended up proving that some dreams are better left in the showroom. The 1989 Eagle Premier was Chrysler's last-minute experiment to combine American muscle with European precision, and it failed before most people even noticed. Developed during a partnership with Renault, the Premier was meant to be the flagship for Chrysler's new Eagle brand, created to appeal to upscale, tech-savvy buyers who wanted something fresh. It had clean lines, a roomy cabin, and a surprisingly modern suspension for its time. But the marketing was muddled. The Eagle brand was barely known, and Chrysler's own dealers struggled to explain what the Premier was supposed to be. Was it a Renault? Was it American? Was it even a luxury car? Under the hood, the Premier had a V6 with decent power and a reputation for smoothness. But quality control was shaky. Electronics acted up. Trim fell apart, and resale value plummeted almost instantly. Worse, the styling was bland. It was a car that aimed for the future but felt like an awkward leftover from two companies that no longer trusted each other. Renault soon pulled out of the American market. Chrysler merged the Eagle lineup into its other brands, and the Premier was quietly phased out with little fanfare. It was not the worst car of the 1980s, but it may have been the most forgettable. A failed alliance given four wheels and a confusing nameplate. The 1980 Plymouth Horizon and Dodge Omni were once hailed as revolutionary compact hatchbacks, but by the mid-1980s, they were outdated, tired, and barely hanging on. Originally launched in the late 1970s, these cars were based on European platforms and offered front-wheel drive, hatchback practicality, and fuel efficiency just in time for the oil crisis. They were boxy but functional, cheap but clever. But innovation fades fast, and Chrysler failed to evolve the design. By the middle of the decade, the Horizon and Omni were up against more advanced imports from Japan that ran smoother, lasted longer, and offered better interiors. The engines in these compacts buzzed loudly and struggled on hills. Acceleration was sluggish, suspension was rough, and the driving experience felt more like punishment than practicality. Interior plastics cracked, seats wore down fast, the dashboards rattled like old furniture. Chrysler tried to keep them alive with mild facelifts and turbo versions, but it was not enough. Even loyal customers began to move on. Fleet sales kept the nameplates alive, but their reputation as disposable cars only grew stronger. By the time they were finally retired, no one was sad to see them go. They had served their purpose and then overstayed their welcome. Once trailblazers, now traffic cones. The 1987 Hyundai XL arrived with a bang. It was cheap, clean-looking, and sold over 160,000 units in its first year. For many Americans, it was their first taste of a South Korean car. On paper, it seemed like the perfect deal, a brand new import for the price of a used domestic. The XL promised value, efficiency, and modern design at a time when budgets were tight. But soon after those sales, the problems began. The build quality was abysmal. Panels did not align, engines sputtered, transmissions gave out far too early, door handles broke off in people's hands, paint faded within a year, and mechanics were often baffled by the Korean parts and layout. Worse, Hyundai's dealership and service networks were not prepared for the tidal wave of warranty claims. As word spread, resale value collapsed. The XL quickly gained a reputation as a throwaway car, cheap to buy, expensive to maintain, and impossible to love. The damage to Hyundai's reputation was so severe that it took the brand over a decade and a total reinvention to recover. While Hyundai today is known for reliability and quality, the XL remains the ghost in its garage. It proved that low price alone is never enough. Sometimes you really do get what you pay for. The 1981 Isuzu Imark diesel was not built to thrill. It was built to squeeze every drop of mileage from a gallon of fuel, and it did that almost too well. This tiny sedan was aimed at the kind of buyer who counted pennies at the pump and did not mind being passed by bicycles. Under the hood, the diesel engine was unbelievably frugal, offering mileage in the high 40s and even into the 50s on the highway. But that thrift came at a steep cost: performance. Acceleration was a crawl. Highway merging was a heart-pounding gamble. And the sound? A loud, rattling clatter that turned heads for all the wrong reasons. The Imark was also painfully plain. Its design was boxy and uninspired. The interior was bare bones. Comfort was not even in the conversation. But the people who bought these cars were not looking for comfort. They were looking for maximum miles. Still, even the most hardcore MPG fans had their limits. The engine wore out quickly. Parts were hard to source. And as gas prices stabilized, drivers realized they had sacrificed everything for a few dollars saved. The Imark diesel became shorthand for what happens when you chase one goal to the extreme. It was efficient, but it left everything else behind. There was no sound more powerful in the 1970s than the delicate, distant jingle of the ice cream truck. Except, it was not a jingle the way we hear it today through tinny speakers and digital loops. No, back then, the ice cream man had real brass bells. He would slowly drive down the block, gently ringing them by hand or with a string attached to the window. The sound was soft but unmistakable. It sliced through summer air like a siren of salvation. Kids would freeze mid-game, mid-bite, or a mid-sentence and yell, "Ice cream!" before bolting toward the noise barefoot, clutching whatever spare change they could dig up from a kitchen drawer or the couch cushions. The menu on the side of the truck was like a stained glass window of dreams. Push pops, rocket bombs, orange creamsicles. And if you were lucky enough to have a full dollar, you might even walk away with a cartoon character bar with gumdrop eyes that always looked just a little off. The magic was not just the treat. It was the chase, the chaos, the moment. You did not schedule a visit to the ice cream truck. You hunted it. But if you wanted to feel truly rich as a kid, it did not involve frozen sweets. It happened in the aisles of the grocery store, with something you could not eat. but you definitely collected. Saturday morning cartoons were not just shows. They were rituals. You would wake up at 6 or 7, bowl of cereal in hand, and stake out your spot in front of the television before anyone else in the house even stirred, pajamas still on, eyes still half shut. But you were ready. The networks fought hard for your attention. ABC, NBC, CBS, they all rolled out animated powerhouses like The Smurfs, He-Man, The Real Ghostbusters, Gem, G.I. Joe, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Each show had its slot, and missing one felt like missing a holiday. But for every golden episode came the heartbreak of your favorite show being bumped, or worse, replaced. The dreaded special news report could interrupt your flow like a slap to the face. You would sit there in disbelief as your cartoon got pulled for a political debate or weather update. No warnings, no mercy. Still, the lineup gave you something to look forward to all week, and for those few hours, everything felt right in the world. Cartoons, cereal, and commercials that somehow got stuck in your head forever. Because let's be honest, there are still jingles from that era that we can sing from memory, word for word. Three-wheeled tri-cars were one of the stranger automotive experiments to come out of the 1970s, and somehow they were totally legal to drive on regular roads. Companies like Dale and Myers tried to pitch these oddball vehicles as the future of safe, affordable transportation. But here's the twist. They were wildly unstable. They looked like space pods, handled like shopping carts, and tipped over if you so much as looked at a corner the wrong way. Some of them were so light, 2 people could lift one side off the ground. Still, they were street legal. There were no strict safety standards for this sort of thing, and as long as it had a license plate and functioning lights, it could hit the road. The idea was to offer fuel efficiency and savings during the oil crisis, but in practice, they were more likely to cause whiplash than save gas. That did not stop eager drivers from picking them up and zooming around town like extras from a science fiction movie. Today, these vehicles have either vanished completely or landed in museums as cautionary tales. But if that sounds bizarre, just wait until we tell you about kids riding gas-powered mini bikes down neighborhood sidewalks like it was no big deal. Saturday mornings in the 1970s were sacred. You did not sleep in. You woke up early, grabbed the biggest bowl you could find, filled it with sugary cereal, and plopped down in front of the television. This was not just a casual routine. It was a ritual. You only had a few golden hours before the grown-up programs kicked in, and every second counted. The lineup? Legendary. Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, the Super Friends, the Jetsons. But nestled between the slapstick and sound effects were something sneakier: public service announcements. You would be watching Bugs Bunny one minute, and the next, a little cartoon light bulb wearing sneakers would hop on screen singing, "I'm just a Bill." Suddenly, you were learning about how laws were made and the importance of brushing your teeth, all while still chewing on marshmallow shapes. And somehow, it worked. Time for Timer told you about cheese and crackers. Schoolhouse Rock gave you grammar. These messages were as much a part of your childhood as the shows themselves. They blended right into the backdrop of your Saturday, like static in between the channels. You did not always understand them, but you remembered them. And as soon as you heard the first jingle in the distance, the real fun began. Because there was something coming that could get every kid off the couch in seconds. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered mini bike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. If your mom ever handed you a little green booklet and a stack of stamps at the grocery store, you already know where this is going. S&H green stamps were basically kid currency in the 1970s. Every purchase at participating stores earned you these tiny rectangular stamps. You would go home, sit at the kitchen table, and carefully lick and stick them into pages of a booklet like some kind of mini stockbroker. And the best part? You could buy things with them. Not just little trinkets either. We are talking about radios, toasters, blenders, even bikes if you had enough patience and pages. It was like unlocking treasure chests using grocery points. And moms? They took this seriously. There were strategies. They knew which stores gave out the best deals, and they would make the rounds like pros. For kids, it felt like a weird game of Monopoly, but real. Every filled booklet was a step closer to some magical reward catalog where you could flip through and dream big. You did not just shop, you invested. And if your family loved collecting things from everyday errands, you better believe gas stations were next in line to turn a pit stop into a treasure hunt. Speak and Spell. A name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and Spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes, it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. Choppers in the 1970s were not just bikes, they were statements, and the louder and longer the fork, the bolder the message. You would see motorcycles with 6-foot extended forks cruising down the highway like something out of a comic book. These things had no front brakes, almost no suspension, and about as much handling control as a brick on roller skates. But nobody cared. They looked cool. And back then, looking cool was more important than stopping safely. Builders would chop down factory models, stretch out the frames, and slap on as much chrome as humanly possible. The longer it looked, the better. Riding one meant you had guts, or just no fear of potholes. Amazingly, these were all street legal. You could register a motorcycle with modifications that today would not make it past a parking lot inspection. There were no federal mandates on motorcycle geometry or braking systems. If it ran, it rode. Eventually, the law caught up, and these extreme builds got shut down by new regulations. But at the time, choppers were everywhere, from biker rallies to small-town roads, rolling art with no regard for physics. If you think that sounds wild, wait until you picture someone doing their weekly grocery run on a riding lawnmower. You knew a toy was unforgettable when it lingered in your dreams, or maybe your nightmares. Hugo, man of 1,000 faces, was that toy. It was not soft or cuddly. It was a bald, plastic, mannequin-style head with eyes that seemed a little too real. And you could change its face. No, really. You got this kit full of rubbery noses, scars, mustaches, eyebrows, eye patches, and even glasses to transform Hugo into anything from a movie villain to a Cold War spy. You applied the features with a kind of glue stick that felt halfway between a craft tool and something out of a mad scientist's lab. This was not a toy you brought to bed with you. It was one you studied, experimented with, maybe even tried to prank your sibling with. There was something fascinating and just a bit unsettling about it. And yet, you kept going back to it. You made stories around those disguises, invented entire secret agent missions with Hugo at the center. Back in the 1970s, your imagination did most of the heavy lifting. That was the magic. And if you really wanted to get creative, especially in October, you did not go to the store for a costume. You went to the kitchen junk drawer, the recycling bin, and maybe the attic. You had not lived until you beat the Oregon Trail without dying of dysentery. That was the holy grail of 1980s computer gaming. Those chunky gray computers in the school lab, that pixelated map, that relentless text box reminding you that little Timothy had broken a leg and your oxen just drowned crossing a river. Iconic. It was not just a game, it was survival. You learned real-life lessons in that pixel wilderness. Like how much meat you could carry back from a hunt, not much, or why you should never try to ford a river without thinking it through. And somehow, we were totally into it. The green and black graphics, the clunky keyboard, the fact that it felt like schoolwork but kind of fun. You would all huddle around one screen, a group of 5 kids making group decisions like mini pioneers, and somehow it felt like the fate of your wagon family actually mattered. It was your first taste of choices in gaming, your first little moral dilemmas. Do you trade clothing for bullets? Do you rest for 2 days? Or do you push on and risk everyone freezing to death? Still, once the school bell rang, it was game over. And if you wanted to know what was playing in theaters that weekend, you did not Google it. You picked up the phone. Back in the 1970s, monster trucks were not just something you saw at arena shows. They were rolling through neighborhoods like local legends. Drivers would lift their trucks sky high with no thought to rollover danger, center of gravity, or whether they could actually park the thing in their own driveway. Tires the size of bathtubs? Absolutely. No visible license plate? Who was looking? There were no limits to how high you could lift your suspension or how ridiculous your truck looked. If you needed a ladder to get in, you were doing it right. Police officers rarely pulled them over because, honestly, it was not even illegal yet. No one was worried about crash test ratings or pedestrian safety zones, and the idea of stability control was still hanging out in a notebook somewhere in Detroit. Today, height restrictions and suspension laws make sure your ride does not double as a climbing wall. But back then, the bigger the better, and the louder, the cooler. Speaking of things that would make today's DMV faint, let us talk about tractors. Yes, actual tractors, cruising down country roads without plates or papers. We are talking about the sweet, heady scent of freshly copied worksheets from the Mimograph machine. You know the one. Teachers would walk in with a stack of slightly damp, purplish pages, and every kid in class would lean in for a whiff. It was like some kind of strange reward for paying attention. That chemical smell clung to your fingers and your backpack, and for some reason, it made spelling quizzes feel just a little less terrifying. The magic was in the moment, a mix of curiosity, nostalgia, and maybe just a tiny bit of dizziness. Teachers would crank that machine by hand, and it felt like watching science in action. Back then, the world felt more tactile. You held things, smelled things, and sometimes even licked the glue off an envelope like it was a snack. Sure, we have tablets and smartboards now, but show someone a ditto sheet and they will time travel right back to 3rd grade. You cannot digitize something like that. But speaking of things you waited all week for, nothing beat the pure joy of Saturday morning when the screen lit up and the cartoons took over. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up. And even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector. And not just of stuff, but of memories. Get this, in the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Phones in the 1970s were not private, not even close. They had cords, long spiral ones that stretched down hallways, wrapped around doors, and somehow always ended up tangled. Every house had one line, maybe two if you were fancy. That meant when the phone rang, it was anyone's guess who would answer and who would listen. If you were a kid trying to call a friend, you had to pass through a gauntlet of parents and siblings just to get 5 minutes of conversation. And if you were a teenager, good luck. Eavesdropping was practically a sport. Someone would quietly pick up another receiver and breathe like a horror movie villain. You would hear that subtle click and knew you were not alone. "Get off the phone" became a daily soundtrack, and heaven help you if someone else needed the line. "I'm expecting a call" meant you had to wrap it up, no matter what life-changing gossip you were in the middle of. There was no voicemail, no caller ID. If you missed a call, it was just gone. But if you wanted real independence as a kid, you had to earn it. And for many, that meant waking up while it was still dark, grabbing a heavy canvas bag and heading out into the cold. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos. Some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. There was a time when a homemade dune buggy could cruise down Main Street without so much as a raised eyebrow. All you needed was an old Volkswagen Beetle chassis, a few hours in the garage, and a wild sense of adventure. These do-it-yourself buggies were chopped, stripped, and rebuilt with bare-bones frames, zero doors, and roll cages that were more decorative than practical. People drove them right onto public highways. No seatbelts, no blinkers, just raw fun and open-air chaos. Some states even allowed them to be registered with little more than a photo and a handshake. And since emissions testing was still in its awkward teenage years, nobody cared if it smelled like you were burning old tires. It all added up to a uniquely rebellious era of backyard brilliance. Of course, modern safety regulators eventually caught on. By the time the 1980s rolled around, you needed a whole lot more than a wrench and a dream to make one of these legal. And if that sounds crazy, Wait until you hear how high you could lift your truck without anyone blinking an eye. Commercial jingles in the 1980s were not just background noise. They were the soundtrack of your childhood. Short, catchy, and borderline hypnotic. From "I do not want to grow up, I am a Toys R Us kid" to my buddy, wherever I go, he goes." These little songs became national earworms. You knew the tune before you even understood the product. And even now, decades later, you probably remember all the lyrics without trying. Fast food chains, toys, theme songs for cereal, they all knew how to brand themselves right into your brain. And we loved it. These were not just ads. They were pop culture. Kids would sing them on the playground like they were chart-topping hits. Some even had dance routines. And the best ones? They felt like a little burst of joy in between the shows you came to watch. It was marketing, sure, but it was also magic. A 30-second clip that made you beg your parents for action figures, Happy Meals, or the latest sugary snack with a weird mascot. And yes, even today, if you hear the opening note of gimme a break," you know exactly what is coming. But when it came to making your own mix of hits, that required serious patience and a strong dislike for chatty radio DJs. The UHF dial was like the Wild West of television. You had your regular channels, your ABC, your CBS, your NBC, but then there was the mysterious world of UHF. You had to twist the dial just right, and even then, the screen might be fuzzy, the sound might be off, but if you landed on the right frequency, you struck gold. Strange cartoons, old black and white monster movies, reruns of shows that looked like they were filmed in someone's garage, and the occasional creepy public access broadcast that made you feel like you were watching something you should not be. There were no on-screen guides, no menus. You just turned the knob and hoped for something weird and wonderful. You felt like you discovered something, like you were in on a secret. It was the 1970s version of going down a YouTube rabbit hole, only with antennas and static. And if you were lucky, you might even stumble onto a commercial for one of the most magical possessions a kid could own: a red plastic viewer with reels that could take you anywhere. Yes, you read that right. Riding lawnmowers were not just for cutting grass, they were for visiting neighbors, hitting the local store, and sometimes even school drop-offs. In smaller towns, you could hop on your mower and putter right into town, past houses, dogs, and the occasional confused police officer. Nobody batted an eye. It was slow, it was loud, and it was very much not road safe, but it was legal. You did not need registration or a license, and in some places, people just threw a flag on the back and called it good. The lawnmower became an unlikely local legend. You might pass 3 of them parked at the general store like horses at a saloon. People waved like it was completely normal because, well, it was. It was practical and resourceful, and honestly, pretty charming. Today, cities and counties have all kinds of rules about non-standard vehicles on public roads. Most riding mowers now are strictly yard-bound unless you want a ticket and a lecture. But in the 1970s, nobody had time for that. If it moved and did not catch fire, it was transportation. Speaking of creative transportation, the next thing might blow your mind, because you could legally build a car in your garage from scratch and still register it for the road. Before recycling was trendy, it was profitable, at least if you were a kid in the 1970s with ambition and a wagon. You could walk up and down the block knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had any bottles to spare. Not water bottles. We are talking glass soda and milk bottles, sturdy, heavy, and returnable. Stores gave you money for them. Not a lot, but enough. A nickel here, a dime there. If you collected enough, you could walk away with a whole dollar. And in 1970s kid currency, that was like a small fortune. You could buy a comic book, a candy bar, a slushie, or save up for something even bigger. You felt responsible, independent, even a little proud. Sure, your hands smelled like old soda, and the glass sometimes had gunk in it, but that did not matter. You were earning. This was how kids learned hustle. Before allowances and debit cards, you had to get creative, and when the work was done, you went home sat cross-legged on the shag carpet and turned on the television, to that one channel you could never quite explain. Taping songs off the radio was a sacred mission. You would sit for hours next to your boombox, finger hovering over the record button, praying that the next song would be the one. And when it was, you had one shot to catch it clean, no static, no interruptions, and above all, no DJ talking over the intro. But of course, they always did. The opening notes would hit, your heart would race, and just as you hit record, that was the latest from Madonna. Coming up next, we've got... And just like that, your perfect mixtape moment was ruined. You would yell at the radio like the DJ could hear you. Why? Why do you do this to me? It was a battle of timing and nerves. Some kids got sneaky and recorded during the night shift when the hosts were quieter. Others became masters of timing, predicting when the chorus would drop, when the ad break would hit. It took real skill. And even if you missed a few seconds of the intro, you still labeled the tape like it was gold. You were not just building a playlist, you were capturing a moment. Free music, sure, but earned through effort, patience, and pure willpower. And if you were serious about your song collection, you were not stopping at one track. You were building an entire soundscape, one emotional banger at a time. Drop a comment if you survived one of these 80s flops, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more rides through the wreckage of automotive history.